House chamber buzzed with quiet anticipation as Speaker Mike Johnson stepped up to the podium, his expression marked by uncommon resolve. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in as he adjusted his tie and looked out across the room with the steady confidence of his office. "Before we begin today's scheduled business," Johnson started, his Louisiana accent slightly heavier than usual, "I feel obligated to respond to remarks made yesterday by the gentlewoman from Texas concerning our judicial nomination process." The usual chatter faded as representatives from both parties lifted their eyes from their phones and papers. It was immediately clear this was no ordinary procedural statement. Johnson rarely used the speaker's podium for personal remarks, making what followed even more striking. Representative Crockett's comments yesterday showed not only a misunderstanding of our constitutional responsibilities, Johnson continued, his tone firm as he looked directly at Jasmine Crockett across the chamber, but also reflected a troubling trend of inflammatory rhetoric that has defined much of her brief time in this body. A murmur rippled through the room. For the speaker, traditionally seen as a neutral figure, to single out a member so directly was a rare and serious step. "I've reviewed the gentlewoman's record, both here in Congress and in her previous career," Johnson went on, his tone turning dismissive. "And I must admit, it concerns me that someone whose legal work largely involved defending criminals in Texas courts now presumes to instruct this chamber on constitutional interpretation." Gasps filled the air. Johnson had breached an unspoken rule, using the speaker's podium to personally attack another member's background rather than uphold the dignity of the chair. The American people deserve representatives who appreciate the weight of this office and the constitutional principles it upholds, Johnson declared, his voice rising, not social media personalities chasing viral moments through divisive rhetoric. As the cameras turned to Jasmine Crockett, the first-term Congresswoman from Texas's 30th District sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Several senior Democrats leaned toward her, whispering advice, but she calmly gestured for them to stop. Without looking away from Johnson, Crockett pressed the button on her desk to request speaking time. The chamber grew quiet as her name appeared in the queue. Johnson, visibly surprised, paused briefly before acknowledging her. "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas for 1 minute," he said formally, his words carrying an irony after his recent attack. Crockett rose slowly, straightening her blazer before approaching the microphone. The room fell silent again, everyone sensing that this moment mattered. "Mr. Speaker," she began evenly, her voice calm but clear, "I appreciate the opportunity to respond to your remarks about my professional background and my comments on our constitutional duties." She looked him directly in the eye. "And I assure you, sir, the next 30 seconds will make clear which of us truly understands the Constitution we both swore to defend." As the digital clock began counting down her minute, the entire chamber held its breath. What followed would ripple far beyond that room, reshaping conversations across Washington. Mike Johnson's rise to the speaker's chair had been as swift as it was improbable. After Kevin McCarthy's ouster and the collapse of several senior Republican bids, Johnson, a relatively little-known conservative from Louisiana's 4th District, had emerged as the compromise figure who could unite a divided conference. At 51, his promotion from backbencher to third in line for the presidency surprised even his closest allies. Before entering Congress in 2017, Johnson had built his name as a constitutional lawyer with the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian legal organization. His legal focus on religious liberty cases in state courts became his chief credential and the basis for his frequent claim, "I've spent my career studying and defending the Constitution." As Speaker, Johnson faced a delicate balance, managing hardline conservatives within a slim majority that demanded near-perfect unity on every vote. In recent weeks, that balance had been tested as Supreme Court confirmation debates consumed Washington. Johnson had invested political capital in opposing the nomination, presenting Republican resistance as a constitutional obligation to prevent judicial activism. The day before, during a Judiciary Committee hearing, Congresswoman Crockett had challenged that narrative directly. She argued that Johnson's framing was politically selective, noting that his past statements on judicial nominations during the previous administration contradicted his current stance. Her pointed remarks went viral. Overnight, spreading rapidly across social media and sparking intense discussion throughout the Capitol. For Speaker Johnson, the direct challenge to his constitutional expertise, the foundation of his authority within his conference, required an immediate response. Facing pressure from his conservative flank to project strength and counterclaims that he had been outmaneuvered procedurally, Johnson made a rare move. He chose to directly confront Representative Jasmine Crockett from the Speaker's podium. Across the chamber, Crockett observed him with the composed focus of a seasoned trial attorney, one who had faced far tougher opponents in high-stakes courtrooms. Her journey to Capitol Hill reflected a new wave of lawmakers, those who entered Washington not through traditional political channels but through grassroots activism and direct advocacy. After earning her law degree from the University of Houston, Crockett became one of Dallas's most respected civil rights attorneys. Her legal career centered on police misconduct, voting rights cases, and criminal defense work that often put her against influential institutions. Among her most notable successes was helping to exonerate 3 men wrongfully convicted of serious crimes, who had together spent 52 years in prison. These cases exposed deep prosecutorial misconduct and led to major reforms in Texas's criminal justice system. Crockett's transition to politics began in the Texas House of Representatives, where she gained national attention for her firm defense of voting rights during heated legislative battles. Elected to Congress in 2022, she brought to Washington both extensive constitutional litigation experience and an unfiltered, principled approach. "I didn't come to Congress to make friends or play politics as usual," she told supporters during her campaign. "I came to speak truth to power and to fight for the people long excluded from the national conversation." For Crockett, Johnson's remarks were not simply a personal slight. They reflected a fundamental distortion of the constitutional principles that defined her career. Having litigated numerous constitutional claims in federal courts, including a voting rights case before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, she viewed Johnson's assertion of superior constitutional knowledge as not only professionally dismissive but also factually unfounded. This confrontation carried implications far beyond the 2 lawmakers involved. For Republicans, Johnson's speakership relied on maintaining authority and respect within his chamber. For Democrats, Crockett embodied a new generation of leadership, one unafraid to challenge entrenched power through substantive legal expertise rather than procedural restraint. For the American public, many of whom watched the exchange live on C-SPAN, the clash sparked larger questions about credentials, expertise, and who truly holds constitutional authority in today's political landscape. The House chamber overflowed as members rushed in from their offices to witness the rare confrontation between the Speaker and a freshman representative. Senior leaders from both parties watched closely, aware that this moment could alter the institution's internal power balance. As Crockett stood at the microphone, her allotted speaking time already ticking away, the contrast between the two was unmistakable. Johnson, the unexpected speaker, commanding authority from the elevated podium, had taken the unusual step of personally questioning a junior member's professional credibility. Crockett, the first-term representative with limited institutional standing but far greater courtroom experience, prepared to answer from the floor. Crockett now had exactly 60 seconds to respond to Johnson's dismissal of her legal career and constitutional knowledge. What Johnson hadn't foreseen was that by questioning Crockett's legal and constitutional expertise, he had stepped directly into her strongest domain, one she had deeply studied, and where his own record carried vulnerabilities she was well prepared to reveal with a prosecutor's precision. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her tone calm yet assertive as she addressed Johnson directly. "Since you've challenged my understanding of constitutional law and my legal experience, I believe some clarification is necessary for this chamber and the American people." She stood poised at the microphone, maintaining steady eye contact across the floor. "You've portrayed my legal background as primarily defending criminals in Texas courtrooms. For the record, while I take pride in my work as a criminal defense attorney, protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans, a core principle of our justice system, the majority of my career was actually spent as a civil rights attorney." Her voice remained even, but grew more forceful. "I successfully argued voting rights cases that safeguarded ballot access for thousands of citizens. I litigated police misconduct cases that held law enforcement accountable and led to reforms across several jurisdictions. And yes, I represented defendants whose rights had been violated, 3 of whom were later exonerated after serving more than 50 years combined for crimes they did not commit. The room was silent. Lawmakers from both parties listened intently. Johnson's face remained composed, but his posture stiffened as Crockett systematically corrected his mischaracterization of her record. "You implied that my constitutional understanding is insufficient for this body," Crockett continued. "Perhaps this is a good time to compare our constitutional records." She glanced briefly at her notes before looking back up. "In 2020, you stated that the president holds nearly unlimited authority over foreign affairs, a position the Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected in landmark rulings from Youngstown Steel to Zivotofsky, both of which established clear limits on executive power." Quiet murmurs rippled through the chamber, as those familiar with constitutional law recognized the references. Johnson shifted slightly in his seat as Crockett pressed on. "In your amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania, you argued that one state could challenge another state's election process. That argument violated the most basic principles of constitutional federalism and was unanimously dismissed by the Supreme Court, including all 3 justices appointed by the very president you were defending." Gasps echoed across the floor. By confronting Johnson's involvement in post-election litigation, Crockett had touched one of the most sensitive points of his record. "You promoted a constitutional theory so flawed that not a single justice, regardless of party, found it credible," Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "Is that the constitutional expertise you claim I lack, Mr. Speaker?" The atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as Johnson's attack had turned into a meticulous constitutional examination that clearly caught him off guard. Senior members of his party were now signaling staff, likely searching for a way to end the unexpected exchange. "You accused me of misrepresenting our constitutional duties regarding judicial nominations," Crockett said, referring to his earlier remarks. "Yet in 2016, you claimed the Senate had no constitutional duty to consider a Supreme Court nominee during an election year. In 2020, you argued the opposite, that it did." She paused deliberately. "Both statements cannot be constitutionally correct, Mr. Speaker. The Constitution doesn't change based on which party holds power." The clock showed 40 seconds of her minute had passed. As she prepared to close, the chamber grew tense. Johnson appeared uncertain, his hand hovering near the gavel, aware that cutting her off might only prove her point about selective constitutional reasoning. Before he could act, Crockett delivered her most striking challenge. "Mr. Speaker, you questioned my understanding of the Constitution. But as someone who has actually litigated and won constitutional cases in federal court for Americans whose rights were denied, I must ask, how many constitutional cases have you personally argued and won in federal court?" The question hit like a thunderclap. Everyone in the chamber knew the answer. Despite his frequent claims of constitutional expertise, Johnson's courtroom experience was largely limited to state-level religious liberty cases, not federal constitutional litigation. Crockett, in contrast, had built her career around precisely that work, a fact well known to her peers, but rarely highlighted by her until now. The 10-second warning light flashed. Crockett reserved her final words for maximum impact. "Mr. Speaker," she said, her voice steady and resonant, commanding the chamber's full attention. "There's a vast difference between quoting the Constitution and defending it in court for Americans whose rights are under threat." She paused, letting the silence amplify her words. "While you've used the Constitution as a political talking point, I've used it as a shield to protect voting rights, due process, and equal protection for citizens stripped of their constitutional guarantees." The chamber was still. In a few sentences, Crockett had not only defended her record but reframed the entire debate as a contrast between theoretical rhetoric and practical defense of constitutional rights. "My understanding of our founding document," she concluded, "comes not from selective citation, but from standing beside Americans whose rights were being violated. Black voters purged from rolls, defendants denied fair trials, and citizens subjected to excessive state force." The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Despite Johnson's position at the speaker's podium, every eye in the chamber was now fixed on Crockett. Crockett's deep grasp of constitutional law and her real world experience as a constitutional advocate had turned her from target to authority in under a minute. You referred to my background in criminal defense as though it somehow weakens my constitutional understanding. Crockett continued, her tone calm but gaining strength. Those clients were Americans presumed innocent under our Constitution, including 3 men I helped exonerate after they spent decades imprisoned for crimes they never committed, because their constitutional rights were violated. Johnson froze, clearly aware that interrupting her would only reinforce her argument about the selective use of constitutional principles. Democratic members leaned forward, watching what many would later describe as a landmark moment in modern congressional debate. The Constitution isn't just a set of memorized words. Mr. Speaker, Crockett said firmly, it's a collection of promises that power will be restrained, rights will be protected, and justice will be available to everyone, not only to those who look like you or share your beliefs. As her allotted time neared its end, Crockett delivered her closing point with the precision of a constitutional litigator and the conviction of someone who had fought in the trenches for America's founding ideals. So yes, Mr. Speaker, let's review our constitutional records, she declared. Let's compare who has actually stood in federal courts defending constitutional rights with those who merely claim constitutional expertise while advancing theories rejected at every judicial level. The difference between us isn't that you understand the Constitution better, it's that I've used it to deliver justice for Americans whose rights were denied by people, sharing your selective interpretation of it. The red warning light on her microphone flashed. Crockett nodded and continued. You questioned my qualifications from that podium, Mr. Speaker, but with respect. Perhaps instead of doubting my constitutional knowledge, you should reflect on how your constitutional arguments have been unanimously dismissed by our nation's highest court. I yield back, as she returned to her seat. The Democratic side erupted into a standing ovation, a rare breach of decorum, mirroring both the intensity of Johnson's remarks and the strength of Crockett's response. Some moderate Republicans stayed seated, visibly contemplative, while others looked uneasy about what had just unfolded. Johnson, still at the podium, appeared momentarily stunned by the unexpected constitutional counterattack. His face had gone pale as aides hurried toward him with notes, likely outlining talking points or procedural options to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her constitutional record, but had also exposed deeper questions about Johnson's own grasp and use of constitutional principles. She transformed what began as a personal attack into a meaningful debate about constitutional interpretation, one that resonated beyond the chamber walls. What started as Johnson's attempt to publicly undermine a newer member became a defining moment in his speakership, broadcast live to millions of Americans who could now decide for themselves which lawmaker demonstrated genuine constitutional understanding. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread across all major social media platforms. The hashtag #OurConstitutionalClapback trended at #1 worldwide, as Crockett's composed dismantling of Johnson's arguments amassed over 30 million views by evening. A viral meme showing Johnson's confident expression, contrasted with his stunned look a minute later, bore the caption, "When you bring a speech to a constitutional fight." Major news networks quickly reworked their coverage. CNN aired, "Speaker questions Congresswoman's legal background. She responds with constitutional masterclass." Fox News ran with, "House floor confrontation raises questions about Speaker's authority." Legal scholars and former judges were soon invited to panels across networks. This wasn't just political theater, explained a Harvard law professor on MSNBC. It was the contrast between someone who speaks about the Constitution in theory and someone who has fought in court to defend it. The moment Crockett asked how many constitutional cases Johnson had personally litigated became an instant classic in congressional history. Law professors nationwide announced plans to use it in their courses on constitutional advocacy. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed lawmakers as they exited. When Crockett emerged, surrounded by colleagues, questions flew from all sides. "Congresswoman, did you expect the Speaker's attack? Were you prepared for that constitutional exchange? Will you pursue censure for the Speaker's remarks?" Crockett paused briefly, composed amid the chaos. "Today's exchange was unfortunate but necessary," she replied. "When the speaker uses his position to attack a member's professional record and constitutional understanding, it deserves a factual and substantive response. I'd prefer to debate such matters in a more suitable forum, but I'll always defend both my record and my understanding of the Constitution when challenged directly." With that, she continued walking, leaving reporters rushing to file their stories. Meanwhile, Johnson canceled his scheduled press briefing, citing scheduling conflicts, a claim few believed after the day's dramatic events. Back inside the Capitol, political shockwaves were already altering party dynamics. Senior Democrats who once viewed Crockett as a rising progressive, voice with limited institutional clout now, recognized her as a formidable constitutional authority with sharp analytical skill and exceptional composure. What Representative Crockett showed today wasn't just eloquence, the House Democratic leader told reporters. It was a demonstration of constitutional mastery under intense pressure. She countered a personal attack with facts, principle, and professionalism, exactly the kind of leadership our caucus values. Privately, even many Republicans acknowledged the precision and impact of her response. The turning point in Johnson's misstep was his tactical error. He chose the wrong opponent to challenge on constitutional grounds. A senior Republican lawmaker was overheard telling a colleague, "Everyone knows she's actually practiced constitutional law. It's like challenging Steph Curry to a three-point contest." More troubling for Johnson's leadership were the quiet conversations among Republicans across the Capitol. Several moderate members privately criticized the Speaker's decision to use his office for what appeared to be a personal attack. Meanwhile, members of the Freedom Caucus began openly questioning whether Johnson truly had the constitutional expertise he had claimed during his bid for Speaker. By that evening, the growing tension pushed Johnson to issue a written statement. "While I stand by my concerns regarding rhetoric that undermines our institutions, I regret that today's exchange distracted from the important work before Congress. I have reached out to Representative Crockett to discuss how we can move forward productively." The carefully worded, non-apologetic response satisfied no one, and only drew more attention to the original confrontation. Constitutional law experts continued analyzing the exchange, with many noting that Crockett's summary of Johnson's amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania was both factually correct and revealing of his constitutional reasoning. For Crockett, the moment marked a defining shift in her public image. Her office was soon flooded with interview requests from outlets that had previously overlooked her. Academic and legal publications sought her insights, and law schools invited her to speak on constitutional advocacy. In her first in-depth interview after the incident, Crockett explained, "This wasn't just about one exchange or one speaker. It was about challenging the idea that only certain people with certain backgrounds are qualified to interpret our Constitution. That document belongs to all Americans, not just those who use it to push a particular ideology." For Johnson, the professional fallout continued in the weeks that followed. His approval ratings among Republican voters dropped sharply, with many citing doubts about his judgment and grasp of the Speaker's responsibilities. Inside Congress, whispers grew louder about whether he truly possessed the constitutional knowledge he had emphasized during his campaign for the position. Most damaging was his weakened authority on constitutional debates. From judicial nominations to executive power, Democratic members began citing the Crockett exchange when contesting his rulings, while some Republicans also grew more comfortable publicly questioning his interpretations. 3 months later, when another constitutional issue came before the House, Johnson made the rare decision to hand the gavel to a deputy before participating in the debate, a quiet admission that his credibility on constitutional matters had been deeply undermined by his encounter with Crockett. For longtime observers and scholars, Crockett's response stood out as a rare moment when substantive expertise outweighed institutional power in Congress. A Yale constitutional law professor wrote, "Representative Crockett demonstrated that meaningful constitutional debate requires more than credentials. It demands a clear, working understanding of constitutional principles and their relevance to modern American life." The broader takeaway in Washington was clear. Underestimate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett at your own risk. The first-term representative from Texas had elevated herself from a newcomer to a respected constitutional voice, reshaping perceptions of who holds authority in national debates, as one senior congressional aide told The Washington Post. Before that moment, some members relied on their background or ideology to assert constitutional authority. Now the bar is higher. You must defend your interpretation on its merits, because someone like Crockett could expose the gaps in your reasoning for everyone to see. For many Americans watching from home, the exchange offered something increasingly rare in politics, a moment of genuine clarity. It showed that real knowledge can triumph over mere authority, that lived experience with constitutional principles carries more weight than abstract rhetoric, and that the question of who the Constitution protects should remain central to our national dialogue. The message was unmistakable. In America's ongoing constitutional conversation, influence isn't determined by titles, tenure, or power. It belongs to those who can best connect our founding principles to the lived reality of all Americans, not just the privileged few. Subscribe for more political analyses. That defining moment when Jasmine Crockett exposed Speaker Johnson's constitutional misunderstandings proved that true expertise always surpasses positional authority. Notice how his confident critique turned into stunned silence when confronted with her actual record? If you value in-depth breakdowns of real congressional accountability, subscribe to our channel now. We bring you comprehensive coverage of major political confrontations and thoughtful insights you won't find elsewhere. Tap the notification bell so you never miss our next analysis. Upcoming topics. Top 10. Constitutional clashes in Congress. Historic House floor. Moments the art of constitutional debate. How to defend your expertise. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts on this historic exchange in the comments below. Was this the most satisfying congressional moment of the year? Don't forget to like and share this video with others who appreciate seeing genuine knowledge prevail over political theatrics. The more support we get, the more informed content we can bring to you. See you in our next deep political breakdown.